The fading red sign clung lazily to its white pole, shining like a beacon into the dry night of the desert. Tommy had followed this beacon, walking slowly away from the bright comfort of the town behind him and disappearing into the dark. The white letters of the sign sizzled and flickered as he approached, spelling out the word Motel. This is where he would be working. This is where his nights would be spent. It had no real name. It was simply called the Motel. It had been sitting outside of town as long as Tommy could remember. He never saw any cars there, or any lights on, for that matter. As far as he knew, it was just an abandoned building in the desert, which is why he was surprised when he got a call saying they needed someone for the night shift. The call couldn't have come at a better time for him. He was in a particularly bad place in his life, the lowest he had ever been. His father had all but given up on him at this point. For all the money the man had, he kicked Tommy to the street with nothing more than a cheap necklace, telling him, "Make your own decisions, destroy your life, but whatever you do, don't lose this. This will decide your fate one day." So Tommy did just that. He made his own decisions, and he came as close as one can come to destroying a life. Night after night of partying, needles, and alcohol became more and more intense, finally coming to a head the night before. He had done too much. He knew it before he even raised the last needle, but he had nothing left to hold him back. He had collapsed onto the floor, unable to get up. He remembered writhing around on the ground in his own vomit, feeling the foam pour out of his mouth before finally letting himself slip into unconsciousness. He thought he was going to die, and in all reality, he wasn't sure how he didn't. The next morning still came, though. The sun had quietly peeked its way up over the horizon, and he woke up to the phone ringing. A voice on the other end telling him that there was a job for him. He got up and felt a rush of elation as he brushed his teeth and decided this second chance at life was going to be different. Maybe he would even call his dad. He reached the old building and opened the rattling glass door that led into the lobby, finding an older man with thin, stringy gray hair and glasses sitting behind a wooden counter. A thick, curly beard covered most of his face and hung down across his stomach. A small, marble statue of a tortoise sat beside him, looking out of place and staring back at him blankly. There was a large book open in front of him, with yellow, curling pages. He stared at it intently, not bothering to look up as Tommy approached him. Tommy sat quietly for a few moments, wondering if he should interrupt him or not. He looked at the book and found that it was a sort of ledger, with names scrawled sloppily on one side and numbers on the other. It was only half filled on the first page, and the second page was completely empty. Tommy was just about to clear his throat to get the man's attention when he finally looked up. "Boss sent you?" the man asked. His voice was like sandpaper rubbing on a stone. "I'm not sure who sent me," Tommy said. "I got a call saying they needed someone for the night shift." The man looked down at Tommy's feet and then slowly up to his head. His old gray eyes seemed to peer through him, making Tommy shift his weight from one foot to the other uncomfortably. "Must be getting desperate," the man said, and then looked back down at his book. "Well, best get you acquainted with the place. We're going to be busy tonight." Tommy looked through the lobby window, out to the empty parking lot and dark rooms beyond. He looked back at the man with a confused expression. "Oh, sure. They're always skeptical at first," the man mumbled to himself and shook his head. "My name's Herm, and this here is the motel," he said, gesturing around grandly with his withered hands. "I think the first thing we need to discuss is—" Herm paused as a car pulled off the road and came to a stop in front of the lobby. He checked his watch, shook his head, and then checked the clock on the wall behind him. He let out a sigh. "Great. They're early," he said. "Why don't you go ahead back to the office, son? We'll continue after I handle this." Herm gestured at an open door behind the counter, and Tommy walked toward it, quickly glancing over his shoulder toward the parking lot. He saw an extremely tall woman walking toward them, so tall that Tommy was certain she would have to duck to get inside the door. Her hair was covered by a black hood attached to a flowing cape that twisted its way around her, covering her red dress. Her eyes were masked by a pair of dark sunglasses, which she was wearing even though it was the middle of the night. Tommy's curiosity was starting to get the best of him, and he tried to slow down to get a better look at the strange woman, but he caught Herm's eyes giving him a warning expression. He quickly walked through the office door and paused on the other side, out of view, but close enough to hear what was said. The small windowless office was dimly lit by a loud, buzzing fluorescent light. There was a small desk against the wall, covered in piles of papers that all looked older than they should have been. There was no copier, there was no fax machine, and even stranger, there was no computer. Tommy heard the door to the lobby rattle open and leaned his head in to try and hear. "Evening, ma'am," Herm said cheerfully. "Checking in a little earlier than usual, I see." "It appears so," the woman said in a pinched tone. Her voice was raspy, and she spoke slowly and carefully, drawing out each S like a snake. "I will be requiring assistance with my luggage," she said firmly. "Not a problem," Herm said, and Tommy heard shuffling footsteps and the rattle of the door again. He peeked around the corner into the lobby, finding it empty. He could see Herm bending over the open trunk of the lady's car as she gestured grumpily behind him. Herm was shaking his head and saying something to the woman, but Tommy couldn't figure out what it was. He reached into the trunk and pulled at something inside with his whole body. Tommy watched as a white, stone statue was slowly scooted out and placed on the ground. It was in the shape of a man, twisted in fear and looking upward. His arms and hands were pushed out in front of him as though he was trying to keep something back, and his mouth was hung open in fear. The phone began ringing on the counter just a few feet away from him as he watched Herm follow the woman into the parking lot, slowly scooting the stone statue along with him. Tommy walked over to the counter as the other two disappeared from view into the dark parking lot. He stared at the red light flashing on the phone as it began ringing again, this time seeming louder than the first. Tommy put his hand around the receiver and lifted it slowly to his ear. The lights in the room around him seemed to dim suddenly, and all the ambient noises went silent. Hello? This is the motel," Tommy said, wearily. "Hello?" a soft, sweet voice said. "This is room 17. The sound of the girl's voice pulled at Tommy's ears, dragging his mind into the phone as though it was a tunnel. Yes, can I help you?" Tommy said, nervously. "I really need some new towels," the girl on the other end said softly. "Do you think you could bring me some?" Tommy looked behind the counter and found a small shelf with several towels and washcloths, folded neatly in a row. "Yeah, sure," Tommy said, his face flushing. She had the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. There was something so sweet about the tone, or maybe it was the texture. Each word seemed to stretch its fingers into Tommy's mind, massaging his deepest longings and secrets. There was such a familiar quality to it, but it also held foreign excitement, like trying to place your finger on a moment of déjà vu. "Thank you, Tommy," the girl said, her voice even softer than before. At the sound of his name, Tommy's heart pounded against the inside of his ribcage, leaving him feeling hot and breathless. How did she know his name? He didn't think he'd said it when he answered the phone. But maybe he had. It didn't matter, though, because the way she said it made it seem as though she had known him his whole life, maybe even longer. Tommy grabbed 2 towels from under the counter and left the lobby, quickly checking the parking lot for any sign of Herm or the woman he was helping. It was completely empty. Wherever Herm was taking the woman's quote-unquote luggage, It didn't seem like Tommy was going to be in the way. He hurried down the small sidewalk that lined the front of the rooms until he found room 17. It was about halfway between the lobby and the end of the motel, and the door was cracked open, letting a small shard of golden light break through into the night. Tommy knocked gently against the door with 2 knuckles. "Room service, I have your towels," Tommy said. The door slowly swung open, seemingly by itself, and Tommy stepped inside. The world stopped the moment he entered the room, as he heard the soft click of the doorknob behind him. A dim, glowing light danced around the room like 1,000 candles in the dark. There was a woman standing across from him, staring at him with a smile. She was wrapped in a towel, her hands holding it up just above her chest. She had shimmering red hair, which hung in large curls down to her shoulders. Her eyes were bright blue, the color of the ocean, and they seemed to pierce through him like an arrow from a bow. "I brought your towels," Tommy said, nervously, raising them up to show her. "Thank you," she said in a whisper, her voice as sweet as it was on the phone. She slowly unwrapped herself from the towel as Tommy's heart began to race, and his head was filled with the sounds of a high, sweet voice singing like a lark in a meadow. She let the towel fall lightly onto the floor before slowly taking 1 step toward him and stopping. Everything in Tommy's reality was now moving in slow motion. The girl pulled her hands up and slid her fingers through her hair, slowly letting them cascade down across her neck and chest, and finally resting them on her hips. "Why don't you bring me those towels?" she whispered, a small curve of a smile pulling at her lips. Tommy couldn't think of the right or wrong thing to do in this situation. Clearly, he was losing his mind, and this wasn't actually happening. The voice continued to sing in his head, getting louder and louder every moment, making his cheeks feel flushed and clouding his thoughts. He took a step toward her and paused as his head suddenly felt like it was swimming from the movement. The whole room was beginning to twist around him, the walls pouring in, creating dark shadows on the edges of his vision, as the woman came slightly closer, moving her hips around in small circles as she floated toward him. The door behind him swung open and crashed heavily against the wall. "Don't do it, son," Herm yelled. Tommy turned and looked at him, the shadows receding slightly from his eyes, but the singing continued, this time even louder than it was before. I don't, Tommy began, but wasn't sure exactly what he was trying to say. Herm stepped toward him and pulled a necklace out from under his shirt. It was a golden rod, with wings at the top and 2 snakes spiraling up from the bottom, their heads facing each other in front of the wings. He pressed it against Tommy's head, and the singing stopped abruptly. The room around him seemed to brighten, and the dizziness left him. There was a loud, angry scream that rose up from behind him. Tommy swung around to find the woman was now only a few feet away, but she looked entirely different. Her skin had turned hard and was covered in brass-colored scales. Large fangs protruded from her open, howling mouth, and her eyes were now golden, with a vertical slit down the middle. Fiery red snakes now twisted and curled up from her head, in place of her hair, and her claw-like hand was now raised, pointing at Herm. Herm grabbed Tommy and threw him out through the door as the woman let out another wailing cry and lunged at him. "You know the rules," Herm yelled. "Not the staff." Herm blocked her with one arm from getting to Tommy and threw her back, before slamming the door shut to the room. He held it tight as she screamed and smashed against it. Tommy stood frozen, staring at the door and Herm, trying to understand what he had just seen. Slowly her cries died away, and Herm let out a sigh before backing away from the door. "What was that thing?" Tommy asked, his face looking perplexed. There was a loud crash as the woman busted through her window, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. Tommy screamed and fell back as she flew at him, raising her monstrous voice in a war cry. She grabbed at his shirt with her claw-like hands as he flew back, ripping it open and exposing his father's necklace underneath. It was glowing like fire as it bounced around on its flimsy string. It lit up the night around them in an even brighter flash, sending the woman flying back against the wall. She screamed again, this time with a look of horror etched across her face as she scurried backwards up the wall, like a twisted and spindly spider. She climbed up to the ceiling above them, looking down at the necklace, and continued to scream at it with fury, her fangs bloody and dripping with venom as she howled. She swung her claws clumsily toward his necklace several times, trying to extinguish the bright flame of light showering her, before finally turning away. She skittered across the ceiling toward the end of the building, finally hopping onto the ground and disappearing into the dark desert night. "What the hell was that?" Tommy asked Herm, his voice trembling. Herm didn't respond to his question. Instead, he sat up and peered at Tommy's necklace. He reached out and lifted it with his fingers as a light sizzling sound broke the silence. Tommy saw Herm's eyes wince in what seemed discomfort. "Now that's a hell of a thing," Herm said, releasing the necklace softly. "You're going to want to hang on to that, kid. It should make the job a little easier." "I don't want the job," Tommy said. "I didn't sign up for this." Herm shook his head and gestured around them. "You don't really have a choice, Tommy," Herm said. "What do you think this place is?" "I just got a call about a job. What do you mean I don't have any choice?" Tommy said, his heart racing suddenly. "You don't have a choice, Tommy. This is where you've been assigned," Herm said. Everything around Tommy seemed to fall into the void again. It was all coming together, and suddenly all of the questions he had were turning into terrifying answers. From his miraculous recovery the night before, to the weird phone call about the job, even the walk to the motel without a single passing car or person. There had been no sign of life, except the life inside this dusty old building. "Don't worry, kid. This isn't a bad gig to have. I've seen much worse," Herm said, and then pointed to Tommy's necklace. "You've also got someone who knows a thing or two watching out for you. You'll be fine." Tommy looked down at his necklace as his eyes began to burn from the tears. He thought of his father and all the warnings he had given, and Tommy never listened. He shook his head and tucked the necklace back under his shirt. He was listening now. "Look, let's make a fresh start of things," Herm said. "I'm Hermes. You can call me Herm for short, and this is the motel. You're going to meet a lot of different people while you work here. I'll try to ease you into it slowly." Herm continued talking as he led Tommy back toward the office. Tommy half listened to him ramble on about regular visitors as the rest of his attention was swept away by his new and sudden reality. He was dead. This was apparently a motel in the underworld, and his father was apparently much wiser than he had ever imagined. He had so many questions, so many answers to ponder, and all of the time in the world.